going to start, and apologies for the delay. Thanks for your patience. I want to first start by acknowledging the Yagara and Turrbal peoples on whose lands the University of Queensland Solution Campus has been built. I want to acknowledge their families and the elders. I want to acknowledge that that land was taken without their consent, without compensation ever being paid, and without sovereignty over it ever being ceded. And I think especially in the wake of the referendum outcome on Saturday, I want to express my solidarity with their ongoing struggles for justice. Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming, those of you in person, and I think even more of you online. For those who don't know me, my name is Dylan Lino. I'm an academic at the UQ Law School, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing this event on the challenges of transformative constitution making in the 21st century, a Global South perspective. Now, I think, coming as we are from Australia, I know we have an international audience online, but coming from Australia, I think, it's important to acknowledge the context here for us when, talking about this topic. For those of us who were supporters of the Voice referendum, I very much count myself among them. The result over the weekend, while not necessarily being a surprise, is nonetheless a pretty significant blow. And I think it demonstrates the very high hurdles faced by those who want to formally amend the Australian Constitution. The defeat of constitutional referendums in Australia is the norm. Over 80% of constitutional referendums have failed in Australia. So this is the norm, and for those of us who would like to see more change to our founding document, this is a problem, I guess. And I think these hurdles are especially galling for progressive political movements who often seek substantial redistributions of social, political, and economic power, and often by choice or by necessity look to the Constitution as a vehicle for achieving those redistributions of power. So today, at least, we're going to start thinking, at least implicitly, about these, I guess, local challenges to progressive constitutional reform through a much more comparative lens. And we're going to be focusing on progressive constitutional reform movements in the Global South, with a particular focus on the recent experiences of Chile with its series of constitutional reform processes that have happened over the past 3 or so years. We're extremely fortunate to have a really incredible lineup of expert speakers, all of whom have direct experience with the Chilean constitutional reform processes. And they're going to help us think through the challenges of transformative constitutional change today. So we are joined in person by Professor Luisa Slava, who is to my left. Luis is a research professor of international law at La Trobe University and a professor of international law at the University of Kent. And he has a very illustrious career, mostly focusing on international law, but he has also done research, policy development, and the intersection of that and activism, I think, in this space when he served as a legislative advisor during the 2021-2022 Chilean Constitutional Convention. Joining us online from Chile is Professor Amaya Alves. Amaya is a full professor at the Department of Public Law and the Department of History and Philosophy of Law at the University of Concepcion in Chile. She was elected as a member of the 2021-2022 Constitutional Convention in Chile. And she has also a string of illustrious credits to her name. Her work covers a whole array of areas: the theory of law, comparative constitutional law, international human rights law, and its interface with constitutional law, as well as the rights of Indigenous peoples and their ancestral rights over lands and waters. Our third panelist, also joining us online from Chile, is Domingo Rivera. Domingo is an associate professor of law at Universidad Diego Portales in Chile. He is currently serving as a member of the expert committee of the Chilean constituent process. Like our other panelists, also has a very distinguished background, degrees from Columbia University and Osgoode Hall Law School in Canada. Does research in the areas of the right to protest, social rights, and the constitutional rights of Chile, and he teaches constitutional law. Look, I just want to give it a special thanks to Domingo and Amaya, who are joining us very late indeed at night, 11 p.m. I believe, local time. So thank you very much. It is 10 a.m. Here where we are in Brisbane, Australia. Now, in terms of the format, we have up to an hour and a half for the session, so we will see how we go. We'll start by hearing from each of our three panelists individually, and then after that, I thought I may ask a few questions and then open it up to the physical and online floor for questions from the audience. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Luis, who's going to, I guess, set the scene for us in I guess, understanding the process that's happened in Chile over the past few years. So thanks, Luis.
Thanks to you for inviting me and Domingo and Amaya, and thanks to the university for all the support for this event. And also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land here at the University of Queensland and across the world. Again, as Dylan was saying, I think today, from an Australian point of view, is more important than ever to acknowledge that the sovereignty over this land has never been ceded. So what I want to try to do in the next few minutes is to give an overview, a very, very succinct overview of constitutional legal history in Chile, with the purpose of not necessarily giving an account of that history and the in and outs of it, but with an attempt to conceptualize how we can start thinking about the challenges of some of the challenges that have been facing the constitutional reform processes in recent years in Chile. And I think that's helpful. I hope it's helpful for at least two reasons. One is for the purpose of this conversation about Chile and how we can think from the Global South about the challenges of constitutional making and constitutional reform. But more broadly, and this is part of the purpose of one of the purposes of this meeting today, is to start thinking together about the possibilities of thinking in broader terms about the challenges of changing law today. And that's important for many reasons. One very important reason is there's a debt that hasn't been paid to many collectives across the planet, and you just can put it just in those terms. So there's First Nations peoples, but there's also women, there are also minorities. There's a whole range of communities out there that debt need to be paid. But secondly, we have, many people say that we are passing through the end of the world as we knew it. because of climate change and a whole range of epistemological and physical challenges that will require legal response. And that legal response will start by some sort of legal change. And enacting that change is difficult. It's been proving more difficult than we thought. So for the purposes of the conversation today, I think the starting point, perfect. So for the purpose of the conversation today, I think at the parting point in 1970, when Allende first came into power, the presidential as a president of Chile, and that's an important moment because it was the first socialist president elected democratically. And with him came a whole range of ambitions. Some will say that were too broad and too grandiloquent ambitions to enact a new order in Chile. And because of that, law was in some aspects radically reformed from the get-go. In 1973, however, he was deposed as a result of a coup d'etat led by Pinochet, and dictatorship that lasted for many years, and that included many really profound changes in the legal makeup of Chile, that they were not new, because Chile had been a conservative, liberal state, legally speaking, for a long time, but that were crystallized in a constitution that is still in place today. It's the I would say the infamous 1980 constitution. Okay, that was pretty much drafted by a cadre of followers of Pinochet and very close jurisprudence, very close to the regime. In 1990, democracy returned to Chile, but as in many other cases, this return to democracy didn't mean a completely overhaul of that legal makeup that Pinochet had put in place. And part of the reason is that it was an agreement, it was a peaceful transition towards democracy. So the 1980 constitution continues. In 2019, because of several reasons, but including the long-seated effects of the neoliberal regime that was also part of the Pinochet agenda, came to a halt when society as a whole stood up and said no more. And that's the famous estallido social, so the social outburst. And I don't know if you remember in 2019 when the girls, schoolgirls, students began to protest against the rise of the train fare in Chile, and start basically breaking the barriers. And that was just initially was just kind of an anecdote, a TikTok anecdote of sorts, but then they really escalated into a full social movement across the country. And then in order to respond to that really collapse of the social order, so you can say protest, and that doesn't sound very dramatic, but the way it came to describe in Chile once again was estallido social. So it was a really outburst of social rage. So it was so profound that institutions had to respond. And one of the ways to respond was to hear the social claim for the 1980 constitution to go. Okay, so what happens is that the institutionality called for a constitutional reform process that began by the decision whether a new constitution was decided. The answer was yes. Then members, there was a process to democratically elect members for what it was came to be called the Constitutional Convention. Amaya was one of the elected members for that body. And during 2021 to 2022, a draft of a new constitution was put together. That was part towards the last bit of that process. And in September 2022, it was voted. And the result of that referendum was extremely sad. It was actually very similar, numerically speaking, to the referendum here in Australia on Saturday. It was 60 plus against it. And I would say some reasons why, or some possible reasons why that referendum turned out in that way. On the face of the debacle of that reform process, constitutional reform process, a new process has been called because the social reality continued to be fragmented and volatile. But the new process is very different in character, is less ambitious, many would say that is less democratic, less representative, and is less interested in responding to the challenges of the 21st century, is much more interested in navigating the kind of front-face problems that Chile is facing today. Domingo has been directly involved in this second process, which is about to conclude, and will also close with a referendum later in the year. Okay, so this is a very kind of interesting moment. And having here Amaya and Domingo is very important because it will help you to get a sense firsthand of those two processes and the challenges that they have been facing. I was to say that Domingo was also heavily involved as an advisor in the previous round. Okay, so when the previous constitutional draft was being put together, because of the ambitious character of the process, because of the challenges that society wanted to be addressed, remember we need to go back to 2019, the impulse behind the Constitutional Convention and what the Constitutional Convention came to put on paper was extremely, once again, ambitious, okay? Extremely ambitious. So there are many examples for this. One that normally is not mentioned, but I think is very, very important, keeping in mind the larger context of the Constitution, is that it was going to be the first constitutional text that declared the indivisibility between in the relationship between man and nature. Okay, so and that was just right at the top. Normally it's not mentioned because again it's seen like a cute lefty sustainable anecdote, but when you take it seriously and the way in which that claim was elevated to a constitutional level, you realize that how seriously it was taking what was in front of it. But also the process in itself was very ambitious. Okay, so there was a parity across the board in terms of the elected members of the Constitutional Convention, but everything that came out of it was finally what it seems to be the most basic call for justice, was just parity across the institutions that were going to come out of the process. And because it was so democratic, the people that go into the convention represented a whole range of social agendas, many of them grassroots agendas. Okay, so many commentators came to say that the Constitutional Convention and the constitutional process in Chile, that constitutional process, was a sort of miracle. Okay, and when I got to, and this is a personal kind of experience, when I got to Chile, that was the kind of the reading, the international. This is a miracle, and gosh, how they have managed for it to work. It is impossible that something so sophisticated happens in Latin America. This is just, is the power of God in a sort of way. And I grew a little bit a distance from that reading as I kind of spent 3 months, sometimes day and night, working with the Constitutional Convention members, because rather than a miracle, it was a wonder. Okay, it was a wonder in the sense that there was so much energy put into making it work. Okay, and it was just human effort. It was exercise of politics in its most plain, mundane way. You have to cope with debates. You have to be there. You have to draft. You have to redraft. You have to concede. You have to make agreements. You have to give up pretty much a good chunk of your ambitions if you want at least subsections of them to move forward. So it was more a wonder, okay, a wonder of human interest and intellectual commitment and juridical commitment, I suppose. Oopsie. So when I was there, I was start moving from that reading of the Constitutional Convention as a miracle to as a Constitutional Convention as a wonderful thing. And every day I used to cross out the central plaza of Santiago, Chile, Plaza Armas, and then there's always a group of what is in Chile known chinchineros. I don't know if anyone know them. They are musicians, pretty grassroots musicians that kind of they dance, and they dance, they drum, and then play the brass, and they spin, and they, as the music goes more intense, they keep spinning harder and harder, and it's a whole kind of everyday act of wonderful acrobatics happening. And for me, what the Constitutional Convention members and the convention as a whole was doing this kind of wonderful acrobatic acts every day in order to enact a different world. Okay, it was not a miracle; it was just a skill. It was human commitment. Didn't work out, though. And I think there's oh, sorry. So what I saw there was this kind of a skillful juggling every day, politics in its best possible expression. I think the best kind of politics is not the one that kind of exists up above in the sky, but the one is here and real. There was a constant overcoming of precarity. There was this sense that they were trying to do a lot with a little, and a commitment to keep moving. Okay, a commitment to keep moving. And I think I will defend the Constitutional Convention above all for some of these reasons. Now, it didn't work out, and with this one I'm going to close. It didn't work out, and I think you can boil the reasons to two, or group the reasons into two silos. No, hermetic silos, but two columns, as it were. Okay, so there are ideologicals and material reasons, and here I want to think about the issues within the Constitutional Convention in Chile, and more broadly what I have seen in constitutional reform process in recent decades. So I have the misfortune of having already lived 4 failed referendums. So the Colombian peace referendum in 2016, the Brexit referendum in 2016, although that was a successful referendum, but for the wrong reasons. And then the Chilean referendum in 2022, and now the voice referendum here in Australia. So some of the ideological reasons that I think it is important to keep in mind are some of the traditional ones and the new ones. So racism, xenophobia, and capitalism were there in the failure. Okay, so many, for example, one of the main body of commitments in the constitutional draft that was voted on in 2022 in Chile was finally the recognition of not only the Mapuche community, which is the main indigenous group in Chile, but also the recognition of all First Nations people in Chile. And then in Chile, that's particularly important because, for example, the Rapa Nui peoples that are what is called in Western language Easter Island, they were actually bought by the French as a sort of piece of real estate, and then rebought by the Chileans later on, and they are not recognized yet as as First Nations with rights over that land. So there was and the backlash against the idea that they're going to be recognized, and therefore Chile was going to be fragmented as a result of the recognition of those sort of inferior people that they should be now proud of Chileans, is just pretty much can be cataloged as racism. There was also xenophobia, and there was also capitalism. There was a question about how to maintain a nation that has proud itself of being one of the most proficient economies in Latin America. There's also the question of identity politics, which is something often not cross-examined in the context of constitutional reform process and legal reform processes. So one of the constitution in Chile was very much embedded in the heyday of identity politics. So when you think about the main political conglomerates within the constitutional conventions, some of them follow the traditional political lines, but many of them, and some of the most vocal and interesting ones were grounded on identity politics. So environmentalists, feminists, animalists, and so on. And that, at the end of the day, generated problems in order to have cross-cutting conversations and establish alliances that were able to then fight back when the right united in a single front, okay, which is often happens. And finally, ideologically, there's the question of liberal law. I mean, one of the ways that people came to characterize the failure of the constitution in Chile is this idea that there was a high circulation of fake news, and the idea is that there were journalists and different parts of the civil society generating fake news. But when you actually go and look at what those fake news were legal interpretations that allow, according to the canon of liberal law, basically anyone can do whatever they want. Okay, and liberal law allows that to happen. So everyone has a voice, everyone becomes a judge, everyone becomes a legislator. We saw that here in the voice referendum. Everyone has the right to say it. Okay, when really legal hermeneutics is a quite strict discipline when you think about it, and many people are distrustful of that. Finally, there are also material challenges. I think social media play a massive role in distorting democratic debate in Chile, as it has happened here in Australia. And even though lots has been written about it, I think more needs to be written about what is that thing doing for conversations about the present and the future. There's also the issue of the motions of democracy in the 21st century. And we have discussed a lot with Amaya about this. Because it proud itself, the Chilean constitutional process, proud itself to be so transparent, accountable, progressive, okay, so democratic that every day these guys had to, at the end of each session, attend a press conference. They were journalists 24/7 packed in the Constitutional Convention building. All of them had to give accounts to the constituencies and the entire nation on an rolling basis. And the motions of how democracy is experienced today exhaust the public, but exhaust the people that are trying to do politics or legal drafting, but also generates a saturation, okay, that some people cannot cope with it. Okay, there's something that is democracy doing that is disabling the capacity to people to commit themselves to a cause, to think rationally about it. And then many people here in Australia experience the same with friends. Okay, so I just don't want to hear more about the voice stuff. Just leave me alone. And at some point you say, you need to cope with it. We're talking here about the sovereignty of First Nations people, but also one also need to accept that not everyone is a critical legal scholar, and everyone wants to hear 24/7 the same story. And I think there's something about democracy that is the result of that. There's also biosocial challenges that people don't talk about when they think about the Chilean constitutional process. Is that, yes, indeed, in 2019, there was a estallido social. Also in 2020 and 2022, and a bit of 2021 and 22, there was also the pandemic, okay? So a virus arrived and distorted politics like a very few things had done in the past, okay? And many of the challenges that these guys came to face in terms of public communication, get the word, the rationale, the point across society, the ability that they were actually managed to function as an elected body to draft an constitution was interrupted by the virus. And that biosocial, Latourian science and technology element of the story is normally not taken into account. And finally, state structure. So with this, when I conclude, I mean, the state is an ideological thing, but it also has some structures that when they are under attack, they react, okay? So one of the things that happens during the constitutional process is that every time that there was an initiative to reform the state itself reacted like in a sort of kind of antibodies sort of way. So there was the central bank in counterattack. There was all of the civil society organizations attached to the state structures fighting back. And that clash is very, very intense, especially if those state structures have a monopoly over a large chunk of resources. Okay, in Chile, like in Australia, there are countries where there's lots of money at play. And then constitutional reform process become harder because the state structures are kind of sitting on large kind of chunks of money and resources.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Luis. Very deep dive, I suppose, into Chile's history, although you kept it very understandable for those of us not familiar with that entire history. And also really kind of sort of suggestive around the reasons for, why this constituent process in Chile in 2022 ended up going the way it did. Look, we will have time for questions at the end. I think I'd now like to hand over to Amaya to share her experiences with this process.
Okay. Hi, hello everyone. Thank you to Domingo. We were lost in time. We are in Chile. We're supposed to talk tomorrow, but we realized it's today. So sorry to be a couple of minutes late. I have a presentation. Can I share it with you? Can I share my screen now? All right. I hope it will be my presentation. Wait, all right. So if I need to stop, you just let me know when I should stop, because can you see the presentation?
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, so I was thinking, reading about the news of Australia over the weekend. Of course, I'm not fully aware of the context, but I was impressed by the results. There are so many things in common. So if we want to talk about the Chilean process, the Global South process, I think we need to talk about Indigenous people's representation and inclusion, because it's all about the Global South. So what happened in Australia, for me, it has so many reasoning with what happened in Chile. And it's something I'm part of. I'm mestizo, so half blood Mapuche. On my mother's side, I don't live in a community. I've never have. I live in Concepcion, which is part of the indigenous ancestral land. And I was part of the convention, and one of the aims of being part of that convention in 2021 and 2022, and to work really hard for it, was the idea of indigenous people being recognized for the very first time in the Chilean constitution. And we failed in a way. I mean, we didn't fail. I think we did a great job in the sense that we really, really pushed for it, but it didn't happen. So I have many questions about this. We have had in the past 12 constitution. The 2022 process was different because the institution was fully democratic, the most democratic institution we have ever had in the past. It was very inclusive, 50% women, but for the first time it had 70 seats for Indigenous people. So even this is the picture of the first night on the 4th of July, 2021. And the president elected was a Mapuche representative and scholar. Her name was Elisa Loncon. And the vice president was Jaime Baza, a constitutional law scholar from Valparaíso. And she was really relevant. It was so suggestive that a Mapuche leader, a Mapuche woman, was elected president of the convention. But over time, what we saw the next day in the front pages of the newspaper was a sign that we were so happy about what was happening. And we thought that was a big, big difference from what we had in the past. And I think in a way, we thought we were prepared to this change. And at the end, it proved not to be the right way of thinking, because we saw signs of racism right the day after Elisa Loncon being elected. And Gargarella, which is a very well-known scholar from Argentina, thought that a constitution should be a conversation among equals. And I think for the very first time, a convention, a constitutional convention, a constituent body was a conversation among equals, because we were everyday people. We were like, some of us were professionals, most of us came from the regions. We were not politicians. Most of us were just like normal citizens that decide for the very first time to take part in this conversation. And some of, I mean, Luis Eslava already told it to you, but some members were from political parties, but most members were independents. We, of course, have a very low democratic density. And that's why, for example, experts or academic were considered most of the time distant from real people. So they were not always welcome. And many ran also to represent particular interests. So people went to the convention to defend water or to defend their indigenous ancestors. And the result of that was a very, very like a fragmented conversation. It was very hard to deal with the overall conversation about the constitution, and the time frame was really strict, just 1 year with no previous agreement, not even of the way in which we will kind of the procedural rules to kind of form a new provision for the constitution. There was a lot of expectations. The constitutional convention was the kind of the state answer, the regular system answer for a huge social uprising. And on the other hand, it was demanded that everything was very transparent. And over time, I realized that so much transparency was used to take little parts of the conversation to show that we were in disagreement. That disagreement became a big issue, even if it was just one conversation. So the Constitutional Convention draft that was offered in July 2022, I think I'm actually convinced that it responded to the demands behind the constitutional movement and the social forces, even including indigenous people, historical grievances rooted in Chilean colonial and nation building past. And it was based on the transformative Latin American constitutionalism, but it was massively rejected in the 2022 September plebiscite. And then I wonder why. And I've been trying to think through this. I've been silent on an academic side, but I've been trying to think about the deep reasons for this rejection. And although there are many political, sociological design, the design of the electoral process, or even the effects of the social uprising, I will argue one particular thing today. I will argue that the reactions to indigenous people demands that were recognized in the 2022 draft were at the center of the rejection. And the reaction could be described, the reaction from September 22 could be described as an anti-indigenous move. And of course, I mean, not many people will be in agreement with me, but I've been thinking of this because, for example, constitutional scholars, though who work at the university, who were not part of the convention, will say things that as this draft was technically flawed, it was dangerous, it was misaligned with the Chilean constitutional tradition. And most of the critique were targeted at plurinationality, prior and informed consent for indigenous people at the regional decisions, regional, so decentralized political state and not a unitary state as we have been for the last 200 years, territorial indigenous autonomies, and linguistic rights. Those provisions for the draft were at the center of the critique. And I think one of the reasons is something I've been writing about, this idea of constitutional comparative law used as part of the civilizing mission, and how difficult it is to look like outside ourselves, to look at others and to make sense and to acknowledge the way in which our prejudice and our ignorance it's an impediment. It's a way in which we are not able to understand the worldview of others. And the thing is, this constitutional draft from 2022 was fully kind of pervaded by indigenous provisions. The most people in Chile, those who have the power to decide these issues, don't know, act ignorant about, or are fully prejudiced about. And although many provisions were drafted by indigenous people through their work as indigenous members of the convention through reserve indigenous seats, 17, because there was a prior consultation process throughout the constituent process itself, and because there were popular indigenous initiative of constitutional norms. These were the three mechanisms that were used throughout the process. In terms of the indigenous seats, there were 17 seats for 10 indigenous peoples. There were used the self-identification international standards. There was a specific thematic indigenous people commission with 22 members. I was part of it too. And there was a full, like all the time, there was a dialogue and a political negotiation between the different indigenous representatives and all the other members of the convention. It was always the question that when we agree on one provision, the people will ask, what do indigenous people think about this provision? And we will have an interesting dialogue about that. There was a prior consultation process. Not that many people participated, but that it was an interesting opportunity. Although many people said that the opportunity was not a good time frame for indigenous people, because it was the summer, and in summer they have their own ceremonies for the harvest and others. It was between February the 14th and March the 4th. But although all this happened, we have a prior consultation process, and we had also 222 indigenous initiatives distributed in all different committees. And there was a specific rule of support by indigenous organizations. So we have a lot of information from indigenous worldviews, from indigenous perspective. And the result of that, I'm sure of, it was a transformative constitutional draft. And in terms of the provision, I think Luis already said something about it. For example, this idea of nature as right bearer, and the idea of protect nature, and to adopt an ecological responsibility administration, and to promote environmental and scientific education. But also for indigenous people, there were, and that was important, 61 out of 388 provisions was about indigenous people. So it was not a weak recognition. It wasn't a one section recognition. It was a fully substantive, long recognition of all the different aspects of indigenous worldview. This is only one section, 102, which is the right of indigenous people and nations to their land, territories, and resources. I'm sure this was one of the provisions that was really, really at the core of the rejection. So this idea of recognizing ownership of indigenous lands, and set up a restitution process as a preferential mechanism of reparation of public utility and general interest. And this idea of indigenous people and nations having the right to use the resources the way in which they have traditionally done in the past was also at the core of the rejection. So for a long time, I'd had this picture of the social uprising. It says in Spanish, new constitution or nothing. And for a long, long time, I've been fighting for this almost 15 years since I came back from Canada after my PhD. And I believe for so long that a constitutional change could bring all this recognition for indigenous people and for so many communities that have been left out of the Chilean constitutional framework. But because of what happened and how it happened, it was so painful that I've been to reading some other literature. And then, for example, reading this paper by Ricardo Sanin and Marianela Machado, I thought, if the Constitution is the trap, if we have been fighting for something that can't provide the answers, that we won't have it through a constitution. And then and then I'm almost done because of time. I know we have so many time constraints as well here. I'm asking myself if the critiques of the Chilean process are also global. And if we had a certain fantasy about international law and human rights, if this legal fetishism was, and then we could provide change through words, through sections, through this going to international law as an authoritative force. And we also believe that this idea of constitutional law was connected to good statehood, of this civilized statehood. And in Latin America, human rights has been understood to be progressive and good. We thought that it could really provide this solution, this path to indigenous recognition. And my final questions will be, if it's really possible to rewrite the rules of the game in process and in content, I more and more think that it's actually impossible, that we need to think in a different way about constituent processes and constituent power. I think we need to readdress the role of international law and human rights standards. I don't think we can talk like we can still talk about we the people. I don't think we the people are a homogeneity, a group of white males that we can address in the same way we did 200 years ago, even in Chile. I think the people who have been left out need a different set of rules and need a different system, a different process. I think we need to rethink the role of experts and academics. In a way, academics are part of the elites in Chile, and they were mostly against the process in the previous one. And I think for sure, I guess Domingo will talk about the actual process, the current process. And I still believe we need to work more on Latin America as the parameter for comparative law, and kind of get rid of the European or the Eurocentrism we have been dealing for so long. And I guess we need to keep on talking. As an academic, it's still really interesting. As a citizen, I'm very sad. I'm very frustrated what happened in Chile in 2022. And I'm really sad for indigenous people that are against, rightly so, distrust the state and distrust the Chileans. I mean, they rejected their inclusion and their participation. They invited them to participate in a process, and at the end they closed the door. So I'm really frustrated as a citizen, and I guess I will have a lot of work as an academic. So thank you.
Thank you, Amaya. That was also really, really enlightening. And despite the many obvious differences between Australia and Chile and the constitution processes, obviously so many parallels too in terms of the debates and the points of resistance and tension to the reforms in each place. Certainly last but not least, I'll hand it over to Domingo now.
Thanks everyone. Good night from Chile and good morning in Australia. Same as Amaya, we were thinking that we had the conference tomorrow night, so it took me by surprise. I was finishing a meeting, so sorry for the delay. And I'm also happy to learn that Pablo Aranda is doing his PhD in Australia, probably the finest soccer player I've ever played with. So Pablo, nice to see you again. Have fun. I have a small presentation. I'm not going to talk for more than 5 to 10 minutes to explain what is currently happening, because this is, as you know, an ongoing process. And I wanted to show that same, I mean, in line with Amaya and Luis, that I think that the main challenge that we are facing today is the difficulty in trying to, I'm not going to say to redefine, but to change or to slightly change the model of social rights that we have in Chile. So let me try to show why. Why did the convention fail? Many of the commentators today suggest, and Amaya said something about that the main reason why the convention failed or the proposal of the convention was rejected was it because the inclusion of the plurinational state. And I do believe that it was a factor. It was totally a factor. Amaya explained very well that it was something that people didn't receive well. It was full of fake news going around the idea of a plurinationalism. And I believe it was totally a factor. But I don't believe it was the only factor. I think there are two key factors that we also have to keep in mind that probably also explain the reason for the rejection. First, and this is something I have to learn while I'm working in the current process, is that it's impossible, I believe, to replace the constitution in the context of a stable representative democracy without what we could call a transversal political agreement. For many reasons, and I also just with Luis and with Amaya, I defend the work of the convention. I was pretty involved in the work of the convention as well. But I do believe that because of reasons of attitude, I would say on the one hand, and design on the other, it was impossible for the members of the convention to achieve a transversal agreement. So a kind of agreement where every political sector was, in a sense, represented. I'm going to say something in the end of my presentation because I think it's happening exactly the same today, but move to the far right. The second reason, this is what I wanted to talk about, is that I believe that the convention proposed a redefinition of social rights model in Chile, and in a sense of the economic relations of power as well, because it was not only the provision of social rights that was being redefined by the convention, but also the recognition of the right to water and other power relations, for instance, as Amaya mentioned, between the provinces and Santiago, the capital city, and the central state. So what we have today, and sadly is being reinforced by the work of the current Constitutional Council, is, as in many parts of the world, a public-private provision of health, education, and pension. Actually, in our case, we are forced to enter into the private pension system. We are not given the opportunity to decide whether we want to move into a public provision of pensions or a private. We have to be enrolled in the private provision of social security. And just those who didn't have enough money to be enrolled in that system will eventually be selected as members of, I mean, as members of the public pension system. We also have, and I think this is a peculiarity of Chile, we have a constitutionally protected right to choose either between the provision of public health, education, and pensions, or private provision of education, health, and pensions. Please bear this in mind because this is something that I will address later. Of course, this right to choose between the private provision of social rights and the public provision of social rights depends on your on money. So I have money to be enrolled in the private health system. I have money to send my daughters to the private school, and I have money to, well, as I said before, we were not given the chance to decide whether we want to be enrolled in the public or the private social security system. So we are all enrolled at the beginning once we start working in the private pension system. But this is the way the right to choose work, and I do believe this is the way the right to choose it will work in the future because it, as I will say later, the Constitutional Council has also included in its later draft. So what what in constitutional terms, what this right to choose has provoked is that it has impeded or made very difficult to include elements of solidarity in the provision of social rights. So for instance, today and some years before, we are discussing whether to amend the pension system. And we want to increase the contributions that each of us as workers make to the system in 3 points, and we can talk about that later in the Q&A if you want. But because I have the right to choose as a person, many scholars, of course, from the right-wing universities, believe that those 3 extra points of contribution cannot go to a public solidarity fund because I have the right to choose. So it's the state, either, and it doesn't matter if through law, the state cannot direct me whether where those 3 points will go. I have the right to decide where it will go. So I want to decide that it has to go to my private individual account of pension system. So this is the way the right to choose has been working, and this is one of the main problems that we are facing today. What the convention did, I think, and this is something I supported and I still support, it was that it recognized social rights. It included some social rights that today are not enshrined in the constitution, in the Chilean constitution, such as the right to adequate housing, as the right to water and sanitation, but left the details open for politics. So it didn't include the right to choose. It didn't decided whether my private funds are going to be part of my private property. So it left, as I said, the details for politics. So it's up to politics to define which is the precise model of provision of social rights. Although it included, and Amaya can correct me, but it recognized the right of private providers to participate in the provision of social rights in a different manner as they are working or they are participating today. Well, of course, the model was perhaps a little bit moved to the left, but in constitutional terms, I still believe that it was open for politics to decide which were going to be the details of that future model of social rights. So as you all know, in September the 4th, 62% of the Chileans rejected the proposal of the new constitution, and we are now embarked again on a new constituent process to replace Pinochet's constitution. Of course, it's a different model. Amaya just explained how the convention was composed. Luis did the same. This is a model of constitutional replacement that is based on a 2 chambers model. So one chamber is the expert committee. We are sorry, it's not 12. We are 24 members. And we were appointed by political parties. So we are basically members. Most of us are scholars. I would say that probably 18 or 16 out of the 24 members of the expert committee. We were appointed by political parties with representation in Congress. And we are actually divided most evenly, like 12 members of the committee belong to right-wing parties, 12 members of the committee belong to the left-wing parties. The second chamber is a constitutional council that was elected in May. And as you see there, it is composed of 50 members. As elections turned out in May, most of the members of the council, 22 of them, are members of the Republican Party, which is the extreme right wing party in Chile. Then 11 members are from the, I would say, classical right-wing parties in Chile. Briefly stated, those parties that were part of the dictatorship during the 70s and the 80s. And then 17 members belong to the left-wing coalition. So that's the state of the art today. And this is something I left to you guys to to reflect and to question and to propose some explanations later. Why did we have a convention composed of 155 members, mostly from social movements and left-wing parties, and then a year later we have an extreme right-wing led constitutional council with exactly the same task of drafting and replacing the constitution. So we do have the power to replace the constitution, but we have to respect certain baselines, as they were called, that are included in the current constitution. So I would say this is a kind of, and I believe that the convention was structured kind of in the same way. It's kind of a constituent process. So most of the rules of the game which allow us to replace the constitution are today stated in the current constitution. And one of the baselines of that process that we have to respect, so it's not open either for the expert committee or the constitutional council to replace that rule, is that we have to include a social state of rights and freedoms. And this is, again, something I believe may be parochial or peculiar to Chile. So we don't have the alternative. We have to include the social state of rights as a provision, but also include the respect for freedoms within this peculiar Chilean tradition that the 1980 Constitution inaugurated. So let me just finish with the following reflections. I do believe that this baseline, the recognition of the social state of rights, which is not at our disposition, I do believe that it was a conquest of the mobilizations, and it was also a conquest of the convention. So without the mobilizations and without the convention, we wouldn't have had that baseline today, which is actually included in the draft that is going to be plebiscite in December 17th. So what are we doing today? Are we, as the convention, totally redefining the social rights model or provision in Chile? And I have here two questions. What we did at the expert committee, because we were tied and we were divided 12 members of the right wing and 12 members of the left wing parties, is that none of those sides have power enough to take the 3/5 that we need to pass a norm and to include a norm into the draft. So we were forced to negotiate. And what we did was that we kind of arrived, and Amaya, don't kill me, but I would say this. In broad terms, I do believe that we kind of arrived to a model similar to the one that the convention proposed in the following sense. It recognized far more less social rights, right to education, right to health, right to social security, right to water, and right to adequate housing. But again, it left the details open for politics. We were very insistent in trying to push the line that we want to have an enabling constitution. So one constitution that different from the one we have, that is more modest in terms of its wording and more concerned with having processes and procedures that are open for politics. And this is the reason why, not only because I believe that the judicial review is anti-democratic and very well drawn in this sense, but also because it has been a pain, the constitutional review in Chile. And this is the reason why we had a dialogic model of constitutional review. We had a simple majority model a simple majority quorum for the pass of legislation. And we, in terms of social rights, left the details open for politics. But as the Constitutional Council is today composed mostly from right-wing members, they totally changed those provisions, and they are, I would say the following: they are deepening the model of the 1980 Constitution. So this is the dramatic turn of events. They are not only including again the right to choose, in mostly the same terms as the 1980 Constitution, but in some respect they are actually deepening the model of the 1980 Constitution. This is what happens, for instance, in the social security system. The provisions as today as of today, because we still have 2 weeks left to close the process, it includes the right of the people to choose, of course, only for those who can choose between the private and public provision of social security. It declares that we, the people, each individual is the owner of the contributions that we are forced by legislation to pay to the private system of social rights, and also that the state cannot take in any form, part of those funds, either to redistribute them or to move forward to a totally public model of social security. So this is a state of the art as of today, in terms of the work of the council. And one of the things that is also, I would say, fascinating in a sense, is that most of the interventions of the members of the right-wing parties that are today included in the council, but also in the expert committee, are directed against what the convention did. And this is kind of a trauma, because as Amaya said, the proposal of the convention was dramatically rejected, but they are still facing that enemy as a trauma, as a phantom that in some sense was haunting them in their privileges and property rights and model of social rights that we have today. I think that's something that is fascinating, and we have to reflect further on that. Which is the elite's bet today? And this is my concern. If you take a look at the polls today, most of the people seem to be against the proposal of the new constitution. And this may be because of many reasons. I think the most important reason is that the people is fed up with the constitution, with the constituent process. They don't want to know anything else about constitutional moments, constitutional replacement, or the constitution itself. They want politicians to solve the actual problems of the people. So they don't want to, this, as they see it, as this elite-driven conversation about the social pact and whatever you want to call what a constitution is. But, and I believe because of the model that is today trying in the proposal that the council drafted, is that the elite is moving to change the polls. And this weekend, and this is the campaign that is coming forward in the next months, the elite and the economic powers have begun to campaign for the approval of the constitution, because it dramatically, more than the 1980 constitution, I believe, protect their status as agents of economic power in Chile. And this is what we have ahead. We have a couple of weeks forward. There is a mix, I would call it, it's a commission mixta, like a mixed commission composed of members both of the expert committee and the constitutional council, because we have to resolve some disagreements between the two bodies on such fascinating issues as conscious objection of institutions and persons that these religious fanatics are including in the draft. So I believe that in 2 or probably a week from here on, we will have what will be the final probably proposal that will be plebiscite in the plebiscite in December the 17th. And this is the dramatic, as I see it at least, turn of events that we are witnessing in Chile. Thanks.
Thank you, Domingo. Really, I think, useful insight into the differences between the two processes, and also how the design of constitutional processes, those choices, those early choices about how to design those processes, really kind of shape the outcomes and then sort of intersect with the popular politics at the end. So look, I have plenty of questions, but I think given that we only have a little bit of time left, I will just open it up to the floor. So if we have any questions online, it looks like we do have one online. So this one is from Graham Orr, who's based at UQ. So he's talking about compulsory versus voluntary voting in referendums. And this is something we have in Australia, compulsory voting in referendums. I think that was also part of the Chilean process in 2022. So do the speakers have views on the advantages and disadvantages of compelling turnout at either a convention or the final vote on the constitution, given Chilean constitutional literacy and the ambition and complexity of the reforms? So yeah, open it to the panel for reflections. Anyone want to chime in on that?
I think I will leave the experts, Amaya and Domingo. Yeah, I'm sure they will have something to say about it.
Domingo, you go first.
Oh.
Here you go. Yeah. So if I understood correctly, I think we have the same debate here, whether referendums or plebiscites are a useful tool or an adequate tool to decide on such a complex and difficult decision as to whether to approve or not a constitution. And we had that discussion here. I mean, let me put it in political terms. In political terms, I think either in the previous experience or the current unfolding process, it was impossible not to have the final say in the hands of the people. That was out of the question as I see it. During the social upheaval, the people were on the streets massively. The people were participating. Political parties were totally out of the picture. So it was impossible not to have the final say in the hands of the people, and exactly the same during this new process. But we have that debate here. And after the rejection of the proposal, we're still struggling and discussing whether plebiscites seem to be the more adequate tool to decide in such complex issues. So Roberto Gargarella, for instance, was very critical of the use of referendums because in his opinion, but also his Rose Dixon approach to the issue, using referendums as a tool to decide in these complex matters may take you to reject a proposal just because of one single issue. And this is again why plurinationality was that important in the Chilean debate. But also in the case of rights, it may take you to approve a proposal which is, as I see it, kind of which is what happened today. We have some rights, and many people may be tempted to approve the constitution because it's including new rights, but it is maintaining the basic relations of political power exactly in the same way. And more worrisome, it's including authoritarian elements because we are experiencing a migrant wave, people coming from Venezuela, and that has been the main battle flag from the Republican Party, but also the security situation. We have, I would say, a security situation just in any normal large country. We have crimes and we have migrants, and this is both the migratory wave and the security situation are the battleships of the Republican Party. Now we have in the Constitution provisions on terrorism, on migration, on security, as if we were, I don't know, a state information, like if we were isolated by waves of crime and terrorism. If you take a look at the draft, you will see that you will have that picture. Like, what is happening in Chile? Poor people. These people is being assediated by terrorism, and we have some problems, of course. But I don't think that the Constitution is strictly talking with the actual reality, but fear is always something that will move people probably in favor of a constitution that is offering security, which is not going to be achieved, of course, because of the constitutional provisions included there. So again, plebiscites are a useful tool. I don't know. I'm more tempted today to say that they are not, but in political terms, I can see an actual possibility of not resorting to the final say, or not putting the final say in the hands of the people.
Thank you. Amaya, did you want to jump in on that, or would you like to?
Well, I think I agree. I didn't like it as a final. I think it was thought to be impossible to approve the binary question with such a difficult and substantive text, of course. And also, beside what Domingo just said, I will add that I think the use of social media is really problematic in terms of the plebiscite, because there are so much inadequate information, false information, the use of algorithm to kind of focus what you show to specific people. I mean, we saw that on the streets where we campaigned for the approval last year. People will ask like questions that you say, where do you take that from? I mean, the way in which the text was twisted and was kind of disentangled to kind of show you that provision that will make you fear to lose whatever you have in a very crazy interpretation. And it was all over the place. I mean, the money for the rejection was 90 to 10 for approval. And you can't fight that. 90-10, it's impossible. And then the real question is where all this money come from. And I think we need to think about this in a much more global way. It's a global South problem, but it's a really global South problem. So we need to kind of do a network among indigenous people all over the globe, because whatever you said, Domingo, in this actual draft, there is not one single provision for indigenous people, a real recognition of their rights. I will never approve something like that. It's impossible. I mean, it's not going to happen. I don't know anybody who will approve. I mean, I don't know that many people, but I don't know anybody.
We might have time for one more question. Anyone in the room? Yeah, go ahead, Renato.
Thank you. Thanks for explaining it. I'm from Brazil originally, so I'm very interested in this. And as a constitutional lawyer, I do like at least the theory of constitutional change. So I've been following it from afar. So please correct me if I'm wrong in terms of what's happening. So my question is more in terms of a comment, really. Because the first constitution, the first proposed constitution, it lost for 62%, and then straight afterwards there was a new election. The extreme right party won, and that seems to mean something in terms of what that constitution actually represented and whether the people in Chile actually agreed to it or not. And then with now the new composition, etc., from what I could read, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, some of the things that existed in the previous draft were maintained in a different shape and form, in terms, for example, of recognition. I don't think it's the same substantive recognition of indigenous, but from what I've read, there is at least a symbolic one or some mention to it. The same in terms of environmental rights. There's still a chapter, I think, or some sections about environmental rights, etc. So my question, which I didn't hear from you, was what were the faults maybe of the first draft that can be corrected in the second, maybe for its approval, or maybe not, because it can be rejected again, and then I don't know what the situation will be in terms of what comes next if that happens. But my question then is in terms of what we read and heard was Chile, the first proposal, Chile will have the most progressive constitution in the world, a lot of rights secured, etc. And there was a resounding no to that. And then a more balanced approach to the new, or at least a new perspective, seems to be in place or put forth as a response to that, and even as a response of the federal elections afterwards. So my question is, what are the maybe pitfalls of the first one that are now being corrected? And I think Domingo talked a bit about that, that are being corrected now on this one, so that it can become more balanced and maybe reach a more favorable, I guess, outcome if it actually gets to that.
Thank you, Renato. Domingo, Amaya, any thoughts? We have 1 minute left on our scheduled time, so if you could keep it brief.
I can jump in on this for a bit, and then maybe Domingo can answer the rest. Renato, right? You know, I'm not sure okay. I could say a lot. I'm a constitutional scholar, so I could say a lot about the text and the imperfection of the text. But I think that the main debate is behind the text. It's what was at stake, what was the power division, who were able to draft the provisions, and the way in which power was tackled. The economic system, but the political system, the regional state, the indigenous provisions, the nature rights, so the limits to a very extractive and neoliberal system. And that idea of progressive would manifest in so many different ways. And it made those who have power, not only in Chile, so nervous that everyday citizens could take that and then transform it into a constitutional text. So I don't think it was a technical problem. There were many scholars and many experts behind the 2022 text. It has, of course, things that could be better, but I don't think that was a problem at stake, really. And because of that, I don't think this new version could be kind of improve. Actually, the expert and one thing, okay, and then I will hand it to Domingo, because Domingo can talk about his own experience on that. I didn't like the way in which this process started, because what they did at the beginning was to establish 12 limits, 12 constitutional principles that could be kind of the boundaries of the actual process. And in those boundaries were kind of the opposite of what we did in the last 22 draft. For example, it says Chile is a unitarian state, so no regional state. Chile is one nation, so no plurinationality. Chile, and then what they said was a sort of a censorship for the actual process. And we accepted that. And then I handed it to Domingo.
Yeah, just briefly, I'm totally agree with Amaya. So just to clarify things, I was also involved in the conversations to design this process. It's not my fault; it just was one of the 30 people that were involved in the design. But this was one of the critical conversations, where to have the baselines. And I wanted to say that at the beginning I was distant from that decision, but we have a say here that is like something like nobody knows who you are working for, because what I saw as a threat at the beginning, these baselines and the expert committee, turned today out to be our small shields of protection. So today the expert committee did what the elected council couldn't do, because it was full of right-wing people, and the baselines also provided for the recognition, mildly, I agree with Amaya, of indigenous rights, both individual and collective rights. This is a small recognition, I know, in comparison to the proposal, but also the social state. So yeah, you never know who you're working for, and I believe that those decisions that I saw at the beginning as a threat today turn out to be some kind of democratic guarantees. In terms of the question, Renato, I do believe, and I'm convinced, but this is not a fault of the members of the convention. I think it was a matter of design, that the main fault of the convention and the main fault of the process was trying to propose a constitution that didn't include, at least symbolically, part of another part of the country that didn't see it, didn't see themselves recognized in the constitution. And if you read the critics of those, I wouldn't say neutral, but more informed scholars or commentators, they will say that more than the provisions, more than the issues that were included in the proposal, was the political fact that part of the political spectrum, the right-wing parties, were not included in the conversation. But today it's happening the same in the opposite way. And what you are seeing is that those peoples that were very critical of the convention are remaining silent. So today, when the right-wing parties use their majority, when they pass the decisions that they want to pass, when they approve the norms that they want to approve, without including the members of the left-wing parties of the council, nobody's saying that we are Chile, so we are kind of we have some kind of Christian uprising. Nobody's saying that we are committing the same sin again. And this is because I believe that what we have behind is economic relations of power that are able and capable and to defend one process that is in some aspects exactly the same that the one that failed the previous year. But today, those same mistakes are not seen as mistakes, but are seen as part of the democratic rules of the game. So you have the majority, then you have to accept. This is what we have been told in the committee expert. You have to accept that this is going to be a right-wing constitution because you don't have the majority. But wait a minute, that was a critical mistake in the last process. I thought we had learned the experience. When economic relations of power are behind, there's no experience or lesson to be learned, I believe, sadly.
Well, with that, we might have to wrap up. I know we have plenty more questions in the room and in the chat, but and we could go for hours. But Domingo and Amaya, you both should get to bed, I think. So please join me in thanking our speakers once again. And thanks everyone for joining us in the room and online. I'm sure it's given us a lot of food for thought. Yeah, look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you around. Ciao, Pablo.